welcome back to the show. This is Brett Hawes, and you're tuned in to Holistic Health Masterclass Podcast. Before I hop into today's show, which is a change of gears, I think everyone is a little bit roned out, and maybe we need a little break from COVID. So we're going to change tack today and really get back to food and talk about the Sapien way and the documentary that is coming up called Food Lies. Before I do that, I just a couple of announcements. I know many of you have joined our Facebook community, so great to have you there. And if you haven't done so, please do. Right, so I'll throw a link down into the show notes there, and would love to get to know you a little bit more. And for those of you who are practitioners, so if you are a health coach, a nutritionist, a functional medicine practitioner, a naturopath, anyone who deals with sort of food, nutrition, supplements in a clinical setting, you might be interested in my upcoming program, which is a digestive health practitioner masterclass. I've had, I think, a little over 100 students go through that. I did this last fall and then sort of took a break. And we're relaunching this as an online program with lifetime access to our private practitioner support group. So stay tuned for that. If you're not on the mailing list, again, just, there's lots of places to opt in to our mailing list. Definitely get on the mailing list and stay tuned for that. I'm super pumped to be launching that because it is literally the feedback that I've got from that program has just been so humbling and pretty phenomenal, to be quite honest with you. And I know that this program is making a huge difference in not just practitioners' lives, but also the lives of their clients and patients. So stay tuned for digestive health practitioner masterclass. That's coming up very soon, within the next week or two. So right, on to today's show. Brian Sanders is the guy behind Food Lies and behind the Sapien. I don't want to call it a diet because it's really a sort of way of being, if you will, a way of life. And, when I first reached out to Brian on the show, I really thought that this podcast was going to be more along the lines of, a keto, carnivore, paleo type of conversation. And I got to say, I was pleasantly surprised by the sort of open-mindedness and also the rational, level-headed discussion that we had about food. And, our conversation takes us through many different areas within food. But I think one of the things that I really took away from this is that there are some fundamental pillars that I think that people forget about. And, just getting back to basics, getting onto more of a whole foods diet with low processed foods, cutting out things like really, garbage vegetable oils, lots of sugar and so forth. But really the word food lies, we get into some of the things that we've been told that are just flat out wrong. And we also do talk quite a bit about the food in the historical context, right? So we look at food 100 years ago. We talk a bit about the work of Dr. Weston Price, and we sort of frame up the Sapien framework. We talk quite a bit on the importance of macros and high protein. Right, so protein is a marker for satiety and for satisfaction. We talk about things like nutrient and caloric density. We spend quite a good bit of time talking about intermittent fasting and really how to transition onto that in a safe way that is actually going to be effective. And of course, what follows from that is, getting into things like ketosis, fat adaptation. We talk a little bit about exercise as well. So the whole idea of, eating less and moving more, and why that's not necessarily the way to go, and what you can do about that. And then we do talk about long-term versus short-term satiety. Okay. So yeah, lots of cool stuff in here. I think you're going to get a lot of value from this episode. I had a fantastic time speaking with Brian on the show, and I really can't wait for his documentary Food Lies to come out, which should be coming out in the next couple of months, I think, if, COVID pending. So I'm going to leave it at that. And as always, if you do enjoy today's show, please subscribe, review, and share this with your friends, your family, and your community. So please welcome to the show, Brian Sanders. All right. Hey, Brian, welcome to Holistic Health Masterclass podcast.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
Yeah, I think it's going to be a good conversation. And, as we said off air, there's just a lot of different directions we can go. And I'm pretty sure we're going to ruffle some feathers, no doubt. But that's okay. Ruffling feathers means growth, means expansion, and also just gets people to think a little bit, which is good. So before we even get into the topic of the day, perhaps what's your background? We'll talk about documentary and all that, but what exactly do you do, and how did you get into all of this?
Yeah, I have a weird story. I started as a mechanical engineer. So I went to mechanical engineering school at UCLA, and I, went down that path. It was cool, but it wasn't exactly for me. And I actually had some overuse injuries from using the computer too much, which is going to come back around later. So then got into tech and, did all this tech stuff. And I had this background in film in high school. And then I kept trying to find what I wanted to do with my life. And it just came back around to film when I saw What the Health a couple of years ago. And I was getting into nutrition more. And, my parents were having these health issues. So I really started looking into health. And, I was 31 when I basically lost both my parents. So that really, affected me. And, then I saw What the Health. I'm like, this is just the opposite information that we need. It's a plant-based film, but my parents followed the food pyramid their whole life. We ate all the things. We cooked our own food. We weren't going out to eat to fast food restaurants, barely, like a couple times a month. And they just got worse and worse. And I think it's because of these bad guidelines. And so I decided I need to make a film. I got into this world. I started a podcast. I have all kinds of things going on in this space now where I'm just trying to promote, I guess, the opposite of what the food pyramid promotes, really.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think a lot of us, especially those of us who've been in this for a while, the food guide has never really been endorsed by anyone who knows what they're talking about. The food guide was essentially developed by companies and meat boards and dairy boards and grain boards and sugar boards and whatever else.
Mm-hmm.
There's not really much in terms of, I don't want to say there's nothing in terms of scientific founding, but yeah, I think the writing's on the wall. And even these days when you try and budge or try and change anything in the food guide, there's automatic uproar, like from whoever, so we told you to eat less of this or more of that, and someone gets upset about it. But so that's interesting. It's an interesting backstory to how you got to where you are today. And so Food Lies is a documentary that you've been working on. Where are you at with that? Is that actually out right now, or are you kind of in limbo?
That's a long process. So, yeah. The new Game Changers film is, this big new vegan film that took 5 years and millions of dollars to make. So I'm halfway there. I'm 2.5 years in, and maybe 1/100th of the budget. Maybe, we're working with like $100,000. We kind of did some crowdfunding, and we got some more money in recently, but it's just long, slow process, and money is kind of the limiting factor, right? So we're doing great though. The film is going to be so good. I can't believe how good it's going to be. That's why we're taking our time. I have an amazing new director on board, so he's just world class. I grew up with him actually in Hawaii, and we're doing something really special with this film, trying to make waves, want to go big. Like there's been other nutrition films out there on both sides. Usually the vegan ones are the ones that make it into the mainstream, but on the opposite side, none have really made it to the mainstream, I don't think. Magic Pill went on Netflix, and that's kind of like a keto film, but other than that, I haven't really heard of any making it to the mainstream. So we're trying to do that.
And I think it's cool. Look, it's good for many reasons. And obviously in our discussion today as well, I will play a little bit of devil's advocate because I want to try and put myself in the space of the audience that's listening to this, and perhaps bring up some questions that they might have that I know you've had, you've had those questions before. That people are thinking about them. But so let's talk about Food Lies. Why did you choose that name, and what are the lies really? If we can summarize that into a real short, I know it's a long conversation, but if we
no, Food Lies. Well, I think that I like these really short titles. You got to be short, and those two words to me describe it the best in the least amount of letters. Even right, we got 8 letters here, and it's telling you what the story of just what happened in the past, say, 60 years. And I think the major food lies are: meat is unhealthy, fat is bad for you, grains are the best thing on earth. These things, that kind of just drove everything in the wrong way. And then you could go, there's some other ones about, like salt. We're like, oh my God, you can't eat any salt.
Yeah.
And then like, oh, fruit, eat, like 10 servings of fruit or 8 servings of fruit. Like, yeah, I mean, maybe if it was not just this new giant sugary fruit that's been engineered to have more sugar. And, I don't think fruit's actually that healthy, really. When you look at the nutrients of fruit, if you actually look at what's in it, there's not that much. It's like we think it's so amazing. It's like, well, look at it, like look it up. Go to the USDA and look at the amount of actual nutrients in it, and you'd be surprised.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of our listeners are pretty well versed in all this stuff, and I think especially when you look at it from a very foundational level. You mentioned things like low fat, for example. We've had decades now to put low fat to the test. We can see that it obviously has really done nothing to move the needle on cardiovascular disease. In fact, cardiovascular disease rates have gone up. Same thing with low salt. It's so. I think that we've had a good long time to have a look at these things and how they've played out. And I think that's why there's such keen interest and debate with regards to fat. So now it's like moving from low fat. Well, should we be going high fat? Should we just be focusing on eating the right fats? Like, where do we go from there? And I think grains, you start looking at things like plant paradox. We'll perhaps talk about lectins and so on a little bit later on. But yeah, you start looking at that now. And so many people with autoimmune issues, for example, cutting out grains and cutting out legumes and really seeing dramatic improvements in their health. So I think that, what I'm getting at, though, is it's a little bit of a nuanced discussion, I feel. And I don't think we're all the way there yet, because people are starting to sort of crack this open. But are we adopting it en masse? Like, absolutely not. Like, we're not there yet. And this is why I'm excited to talk to you today, because I know that what you're doing with the film and a lot of the stuff I've seen you post online is doing just that. We are trying to sort of like bring this out into the mainstream a little bit more. So yeah, I don't know. Sugar is another one. I think we, low fat, high sugar, and then boom, here we are today. So diabetes rates are crazy. But one, you've sort of coined this phrase, the sapien diet, right? Is it a sapien diet, or is it more just a way of eating?
Kind of, yeah. I don't even like the word diet, but I had this word victus, which is a Latin word that means your sustenance. It's like your way of eating the food, the array of foods that keep you healthy. I like to start that word, but that could be a 10-year process. But it's a sapien way of life. It's just how humans should live. And this kind of all ties into the nuance and there's different messages out there. I'm trying to not say there's one way to do things too. Like, I understand that a low-fat diet can work, and a lot of people in the nutrition space, like, oh, you guys are denying this, or you guys don't believe in calories, or like, no, I get it. We've seen this experiment that the low-fat diet doesn't work if you just throw it out to the public and have processed foods and all this. But yes, of course, technically it can work. Of course, like, no one's denying this. So I want to show the both sides of nutrition. So that's a big thing with how I even came up with the sapien framework, sapien diet, whatever you want to call it, is that there's an array of ways that humans have lived. We've lived all over the earth, right? And there's all different kinds of foods available. And depending on the geography or the season or even the time in history, right? If we're looking at an ice age, or we're looking at these northern climates, like, all right, maybe they didn't have plants for, the 11 months of the year. So we're trying to factor in all these things. There's no one way to eat, right? But there is a framework. And I think I've interviewed about 150 people by now for the film, for podcasts, for phone calls I've had. And I try to just put that all together. I have this sort of engineering background, I'm like looking at systems, architect, all this kind of stuff, big picture. And I don't want to get like dogmatic about one way of doing things. So this is all kind of leading into, what we're going to do in the film and what the sapien framework is, which is what are the unifying themes that I found, right? Talking to all these different people and looking at both sides. So what is everyone doing correctly that has a good diet throughout history, throughout the world, modern world, old, new, like we're going to look at all these themes, and then what are they not doing if they are healthy? So then those common themes become very obvious when you start doing that. And so I even did a visual of the Sapien framework where it includes different types of diets. Like you can have a pescatarian diet in the Sapien framework, because if you're eating all whole foods and you're getting some really nutrient dense seafood, then there's nothing wrong with that diet, right? If you're not eating a bunch of sugar and grains, maybe, I mean, some people can even eat grains, especially if you properly prepare them. So I got really into Weston Price, and maybe your listeners are probably well aware, but he's traveled around, found all these same things I'm talking about, the common things people did, and then what they avoided. And it was what they all avoided was the sugar, the refined grains, and the vegetable oils, right? And that's what most of our food's made up these days. And what they all did do in common is they embrace nutrient dense animal foods, especially around pregnancy. And they regarded these animal fats and nose to tail, and they would eat the entire animal and the organs and the bone marrow. And so that I kind of looked into that a lot and brought that in. But then that it's a good way to look at all the different diets and what works and what doesn't, right? And because Weston Price went all over the world, and then they were very different populations, but they had these commonalities.
Well, yeah, and I think that I've obviously looked at Weston Price a lot. Like I've taught that to a lot of my students, and what's always interesting. I mean, the Weston Price Foundation itself gets slammed these days a lot. Just by more of the plant-based vegan communities, and I think that what I've seen them do is sort of, I don't want to say bastardize it a little bit, but they've tried to really push everything into this one neat little box, and to sort of say like everyone should do this one thing. And I think it detracts a lot from what Weston Price actually found, in that when he traveled around to all of these different countries, he saw people, as you said, eating whole foods first of all. We'll come back to that in a second. But also a big area is eating locally. This was pre-industrialization. Like people didn't have access to imported foods, to a lot of processed foods. And once he started comparing let's say the grandparents' generation with the children's generation, it was all of a sudden they started eating foods that were not from there, that were more processed, and they detracted from whatever their traditional diet was. And that started the tooth decay, the sort of declines in health. But the other thing, which I think is, you touched on, is the fact that the diets were all different, right? Which is interesting. So, they ate locally. And if you look at Scottish people eating, salmon head stuffed with oats, right? Like that's what their thing was. But if you go to Switzerland, it's like a completely different diet, and they're eating high fat dairy, and, you just keep going on and on. And I think just coming back to whole foods, I think that's a really good place for people to start before they start really getting like very nitpicky and polarized with diet.
Yeah. Well, I think that's the most important thing. That's really the unifying theory of nutrition. If you could talk to anyone, that's like the one thing people can agree on from all sides, and it is for a reason. And properly preparing the foods. Well, that ties into this too, and locally, and these methods that we use. I kind of got off track for a second, but talking about the grains, right? He found that yes, they were eating grains, but they would soak them overnight and ferment them. And if you were making a sourdough bread, it was long fermented, and it changes, the gluten and all these other things, and anti-nutrients, and everything they did was about making the food more bioavailable, the nutrition more bioavailable. So whether it be fermenting vegetables or doing stuff, these things would, get out some of the anti-nutrients and help, make the nutrients more bioavailable.
Yeah. So just coming back to the Sapien framework of eating, so whole foods is one, I think we can both agree on that. Are there any other sort of defining features or unifying themes that you feel, you mentioned animal products, and I'm assuming that animal products could be quite diverse. Depending on where you are, depending on what's around you. So maybe you can expand on that, and then let's talk about some of these other unifying themes.
Yeah. So there's kind of these pillars, like nutrient dense whole foods is number one. So we kind of covered that. And number two, well, animal foods. Yes, I believe most people in the world, in westernized countries, there's, studies, I think it was the US, it was 88% of people are not metabolically well, so they have some sort of problems. And so we need to, I think the easiest way and the most effective way, and for many reasons we can go into, is I believe we should be embracing, focusing on protein. First of all, focusing on complete protein, embracing fat, and minimizing carbs. That's kind of just a general sapien framework. Maybe you can do the opposite. And some people like to have high carb diets, and you can formulate a diet. You know what I mean? Like some people.
Yeah.
But I mean, really, this is the framework that works for the most people, especially if they already have some sort of metabolic damage. Let's minimize the carbs, embrace fat, and focus on protein. And you're talking about these animal foods, and animal foods have complete protein. And again, trying to be balanced. Yes, you can get, complete protein by mixing all these different plant sources, and you're refining them out, or you're processing them, or you're getting them from around the world. You're talking about locally, right? It's like you can't always get complete protein from plant sources locally. So it doesn't make sense that's what we should be doing. It's that the animal foods have the complete protein. It has everything you need.
Mm-hmm. So, and I think you're spot on. I think for us in the space, for myself as a functional medicine practitioner, and just looking at which way the wind is blowing, I think that it's starting to become somewhat agreed on by most parties that at least keeping your carbohydrate intake in check is a good starting place, right? So maybe not everyone should be going from eating 6 meals a day to going 1 meal a day and 90% fat kind of thing. Like it's a little bit of a shock to the system, and it's perhaps a little bit radical for a lot of people. So I think for listeners and for general public, I think you're right, keeping your carbs in check, focusing on proteins, fats, that's going to help to stabilize blood sugar, which then stabilizes insulin production, et cetera, and there's your metabolism at least moving in the right direction.
Absolutely, and then the last thing is just don't eat all the time, right? We had so that's really the sapien framework, and what I've seen in all these different diets is they do kind of these three things. Not exactly, because some cultures don't have access to enough fats, so they have to rely on carbs more, but they're eating whole food carbs. But they're not eating all the time. You're not snacking, and this whole idea of 6 meals a day, I'm sure you've covered this kind of thing before, but it's just really important, I think, to give your body some rest. And there's all this autophagy, and just let's not be constantly giving your body this stimulus of food, and let's have some times off.
Yeah. So what have you found? I mean, in talking to people, what have you found with, like, intermittent fasting is obviously like a huge, topic these days. People are talking about it. There's a million ways from Sunday to do it. But in speaking to all of these people, have you sort of found, perhaps from maybe a historical perspective, like, were people intermittent fasting, back in the day? Like, how were they doing that? And obviously it was done more, not by choice in many instances. It was just what was around. If you were on the hunt for 4 days, well, you probably weren't going to eat too much for 4 days. But once you killed the animal, like, you're going to eat a lot,
There's all kinds of ways to look at it. And that is the complicated part, because everyone you talk to will have their own way of doing it. And you're also, which time of history are we looking at? So yes, for most of history, it's like you said, we could have gone 4 days without food, or we could have been doing 1 meal a day, all this kind of stuff. But then even in more modern history, it's really interesting that basically all religions have a component of fasting in it, right? So even though if we did have food in abundance, or not maybe abundance, depending on what time of history, we still knew it was good to not eat all the time. And it was right. Why else would it be worked into all religions all around the world? People understood it's healthy. So for me, I like to just keep it simple, where for me, a daily not eating for 16 hours is great, right? It's just a condensed eating window within 8 hours. And then sometimes I don't know, I'm just not a big extended. And I do like the idea that some people have, Dr. Peter Attia, like different, maybe once a week, I'm not going to eat for 24 hours, or once a quarter, I'm not going to eat for 2.
Yeah.
I'm not going to eat for 5 days. You know what I mean? There's too many permutations of all these different ways to do it. And I think the simplest way to do it is just maybe just eat during an 8-hour window daily.
Yeah. I mean, and it's funny because I've started seeing things floating around on Facebook where, you've got people that are quite well respected, that have got big followings, and they're just, there's no context to the intermittent fasting. It's sort of like, you can just do this, just go for it. And, you got these people that are coming off a standard American diet, they're just like overweight, their body's got lots of toxins, their metabolism's a wreck, and they're trying to go on one meal a day where it's just, 80% fat, and they're just having an awful time of it where, they can't sleep, like they're getting worse, they're tired, and it's just like, holy smokes.
It's backfiring.
Yeah, you can't just, you can't go like so crazy right out the gate, and I'm just finding that a lot of people are not, as far as I can see, and perhaps you can comment, is actually gravitating or moving yourself from where you are now and working your way onto some type of moderate intermittent fasting schedule.
No, that's exactly right. So I do also work with a doctor here in LA, and I work in a clinic called Evolve Healthcare, and we have a program, and it's definitely not starting off the bat with that. First, it's like, let's cut down on the processed foods, right? Step one is just, let's move towards whole foods. Then it's, let's cut down the carbs and sugar. Then it's, let's start getting fat adapted. And, that could be, it could take a couple weeks just to get there. And then it could be 3 more weeks to get fat adapted.
Yeah.
Then, maybe we can start talking about fasting. Like, you know what I mean? This is maybe 6 weeks in.
Mm-hmm.
We're not going to start people fasting in week 1. So you're right. It's a process, and your body has to be ready for it.
So talk to me a little bit about, for our listeners anyway, fat adaptation. Like, maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Yeah.
People who don't know what that is.
Sure. Yeah. Well, ketosis, people heard of keto diets. I mean, this is kind of what it is. You're training your body to be fat adapted. It just means, you're keto in a way that your body has to switch over to a fat burning metabolism. And most people don't have this fat burning metabolism ever used, right? Most people are eating carbs, they're eating frequently, they're never tapping into this mechanism. And so kind of the ultimate goal is to be metabolically flexible, right? So metabolically flexible means that you could burn fat or glucose, whatever is available. And most people can only burn glucose. So being fat adapted is spending enough time to get your system to switch over, and that the metabolic machinery kind of switches into this state where if you give it few enough carbs, for some people, on average, people say, it's like less than 50 grams of carbs per day, and you do that for, sometimes up to 3 weeks, you will probably be, quote, fat adapted and be able to, produce ketones well.
Right. So, and that process, since you're working in that space and really focusing in on that, you've seen that it takes anywhere from 2 to 6 weeks kind of thing for people?
Something like that. Yeah, exactly. And then people listening also might hear about the keto flu. And you could, if you don't have enough electrolytes, or if you're just, kind of not doing it properly, or even if you are, it's just your body's kind of switching over, and you should watch in that 2 to 3 week range. I remember it happening for me, and I had no energy for a couple days where I just felt terrible. Like I couldn't, I would try to go play beach volleyball, and I played like 1 game and had to leave when I usually play 10. So, yeah.
So I think another point of clarification for our listeners, when we're talking about, this whole idea of switching to fat burning mode, right? So I'll sort of back up a couple of steps for people who might not know about any of this. So your body is essentially designed biologically to burn carbohydrates and fats for energy, right? We can burn proteins, but it's very inefficient, and we prefer not to do it that way. So if we're eating carbohydrates all the time, carbs can turn to fat, therefore we put on weight plus insulin. And now we constantly feed our body carbohydrates, and we never actually learn how to metabolize the stored fat that we have, aka our weight. So now, coming on point, when we look at burning fats, right? Do you feel that fat adaptation? Do you have to be in ketosis to be able to train your body to do that, or can you get to that's question one, and then follow up? Or do you feel that there's a a point along the journey where people are able to switch between burning carbs and burning fats? Like, because I don't know what your thoughts are on 24/7 ketosis, but I'm personally not a big fan.
Oh, me neither. No, I've never been a fan of 24. Yeah, like people who do it for years at a time, and I don't think that's natural. It's not evolutionarily accurate, I don't believe. And
well, no one's ever done that. I mean, maybe the Inuit up in the Arctic, maybe, because they had like zero plants around them. But
yeah, maybe. But then still, I think for some part of the year, I mean, maybe they did it 9 months out of the year.
Right.
But then I believe, they had some more plant foods, or they even traded for, plant foods
other
or
stuff. Yeah.
Or so yeah, I don't think it's a good idea. There's many reasons why. I mean, so yeah, I like to be metabolically flexible. So yes, you don't have to be constantly in ketosis. You can be fat adapted and not be having high ketone readings. If you wanted to measure your ketones, you wouldn't always be throwing off these high readings. Yeah. You can be in low level ketosis and that's just fine, or you could come in and out of ketosis and just fine. I personally don't like to ever worry about it or check. And so I'm assuming when I wake up, and I haven't been eating a lot of carbs, of course I'm in ketosis, but then I'm going to eat a meal, and if I'm out, I'm out, and if not, I'm not. And then if I'm going to do a workout, so I work out in the evening, I want to come out of ketosis after my work. I want to have a refeed. I like this strategy of having, working out, like do some resistance training, lift weights. Like, let's put a stimulus on our body and be in an anabolic mode for a little bit, right? And I will refeed and eat a bunch of protein, and maybe I'll have some carbs, and I wanted to tell my body, like, get bigger, like, let's grow. But I don't always want to be in that growth mode. So my new kind of ideas about all this, taking it in from all sides, and everyone's like saying their different ways of doing things. Like, what if we, have some time, a short window where I am in this anabolic mode. I am, there's mTOR and there's IGF-1. People are talking about these things as a bad thing. And, maybe it is a bad thing if you're constantly producing these things and these growth factors, right? Mm-hmm. But if I'm kind of, mostly fat burning for most of the day, and I'm in like an anti-catabolic state, right? So ketosis is anti-catabolic. So it helps you to not break down, right? It's this mode.
Yeah. I know. It's like maintenance
mode. And then, so maybe I'll eat a smaller, like, keto meal for lunch and still stay in this sort of longevity state, we might call it. And then I'm going to work out and be in a growth state, which is, but then I'm not always in the growth state, right? So I think this is the best thing I can do for longevity for myself, is you want to carry lean muscle mass. Lean muscle mass is great for a million things. Mm-hmm. It's great as you age, for sure. Keep your lean muscle mass as you age. And so I want to be in this growth state for some time of the day, but not always. So if you look at kind of these diet wars out there, and people are like, oh, plant-based diets and this and that, like, meat causes you to produce mTOR, and that, you don't always want that. Well, guess what? Eating a whole bunch of carbs 6 times a day is going to produce way more mTOR than eating, one big meal of meat in the evening, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that's kind of some of this nuance that people need to understand, is that there's consequences of every type of food you eat, and
Yeah. Well, and I think, part of why I wanted you to speak a little bit about that is that there's misinformation out there, but everyone, not everyone, but there's also a very dogmatic approach to a lot of these styles of eating, right? And, as I said, like, you've got people that are coming off a standard American diet and just going one meal a day and just going for it, right? Mm-hmm. But I also think that, the reason why I wanted you to speak about it is to help listeners maybe figure out how to get there. Do you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And also to not agonize so much. You've got people that are literally carrying, ketone sticks around with them all day long and panicking. If there's like 12 grams of carbs in some kind of greens powder, they're freaking out because they don't want to come out of ketosis. And it's like, there was never a culture in history that was vegan. And there was never a culture in history that was permanently in ketosis either.
Yeah.
So I don't think that either of those extremes is a very good way to exist on a permanent basis.
Absolutely. That's a good message. And and that's kind of what the sapien diet's all about. It's not a keto diet. You will be fat adapted probably if you do it correctly, but it's definitely not a ketogenic like 24/7 diet at all. And yeah, people need, part of it is people are even stressed out about it. I mean, we're learning more about how much just stress and sleep and all these other factors come in. And I've seen people who are so stressed out about it, and they're having like a food journal. They're like, oh my God, like what is this? I can't go to eat there. And they're screwing up their life, kind of. They have like no social life, or they just so many problems if you get too wrapped up in it. So yeah, it's a good message.
Well, and this is why I've been following you for a while on Facebook, and I've seen what you're putting out, and I like it because it is more of a sort of quote unquote primal ancestral type of diet that's rooted in whole foods, and that has some flexibility to it. And I think that's very important for people. Because, I've taught nutritionists and I've taught at a school for a really long time. And I would see people come out after their training with eating disorders. So it's like after you've learned all this stuff, then you freak out and then you develop the eating disorder because you're so confused. Either you're confused about what to eat, or you become so fixated on one way of eating that even if it turns out that way of eating is not working for you, you still continue with it until your health breaks down, and then you come to some pretty harsh realizations. Which is
that's very true, and I've seen all kinds of stuff like that. Yeah.
It's kind of crazy, right? So there's a couple of other things I wanted to talk to you about. This whole idea of movement, so we talk about calories in, calories out, and the whole notion of eat less, move more. Perhaps you can unpack that a little bit and see why maybe that's not necessarily the right way to go.
Yeah, exactly. So eat less, move more. Yeah, I hate that statement, right? It's kind of what our community, I don't know if you're, how into my world you are, but that we don't need to be tracking calories every second. I think it's good to know how many calories are in foods, right? In the beginning. Like some people don't have any idea about macros, and it's like, oh, how much fat, carbs, protein, they don't even understand that, how much is in food or how many calories. But yes, once you kind of learn, I don't think you need to ever track this. And I think it's a stupid, eat less, move more is basically just telling someone like spend less, make more money. It's like, okay, great. Spend less, make more money. That you're a genius. Thank you for telling me how to be rich. So you need to tell someone what to do, right? Let's give a prescription, right? This is what health professionals are supposed to do. And saying spend money and spend less and make more is not a prescription. So my prescription would be to eat densely, move intensely. Okay,
so what do you mean by that?
Eat densely, so eat nutrient-dense foods. So I believe that calories should take care of themselves if you're eating the correct foods. And I really believe in satiety, and I think everything revolves around satiety. I'm actually writing a whole book that's revolving around satiety. That if you are eating the correct foods, you will naturally regulate your appetite, and everything makes sense. So that's why in our kind of high-fat worlds, whole foods world, people are naturally losing weight. They're not counting calories because they're just naturally full, and everything works out. So eat densely means and there's even the nutrient component too, where if you're getting full nutrients, some people might be having, I don't know if I've seen some studies, but it's not like super hard in the literature yet of like nutrient deficiency causing hunger, right? But if you're eating a processed food diet without enough nutrients, you have this, your body is not being satisfied.
Yeah. Well, so think about it, I'll just add to that because I've been banging on about that for years, right? It's, if you just think about it from a fundamental standpoint, like your body requires nutrients. Yes, we require calories for energy, 100%, but we require nutrients biologically to be metabolically stable or optimized for all of our body functions to run. So you can imagine if you're eating a diet that is lacking nutrients, right, but loaded with calories, essentially what's happening is from a caloric perspective, you're fine, like no problem, right? You're getting more than enough calories, but your body's crying out for nutrients. And so what will happen is that as you crave food, you're not really craving food, you're craving nutrients in a sense, because you got more than enough calories, right? And so
100%.
I've always said, it's the catchphrase there is overfed and undernourished, and overfed and undernourished. I mean, you're never going to be satisfied, like plain and simple.
That's exactly it. I mean, this is all tying together completely correct. And part of it too, I think, is it's protein and micronutrient dilution, right? If you're diluting those out, this is kind of a Dr. Ted Naiman concept. If anyone knows who that is, he's great.
I do know, yeah.
Yeah, it's just that what all the happened in the past 6 years, and especially with the processed foods, is we're diluting the amount of protein and micronutrients in foods and stuffing in sugar, refined grains, and oils. And so, yes, there's a thing called the protein leverage hypothesis, which is kind of like this overfed, undernourished thing. Is your body wants, this is a theory that I think is very good, that your body wants to eat until it gets enough protein and micronutrients. We'll throw that in there too, right? That there's this actual mechanism that they've done studies, and maybe they weren't in human studies. It's a little hard to do them, but they did it in some animal models, that animals ate until they got enough protein. So if you took like a rat chow and you diluted out the protein with a whole bunch of extra calories, right? Some refined grains or something, they kept eating until they got the same amount of protein as the other group did, right? That just had the protein, 20, we'll call it 20% protein. So they diluted it out. They ate way more calories to get the same amount of protein, right? So it's very interesting, and I think it's very accurate with what's happening in America. It's exactly what you're talking about. Is people are trying to eat the same amount of nutrients, and protein is an essential nutrient plus the micronutrients. And because our food system is so messed up, they're having to eat way more calories to get the same amount of nutrients. So it's just kind of depending on how you look at it. It's exactly what you're talking about.
So do you feel, we'll come back to the movement in a second, moving intensely, but I just want to sort of go with where we're at right now. Do you feel, a couple of things that I'll throw out at you, the notion that people are eating too much protein is one, like, we're eating too much protein. You'll sort of hear that from the plant-based community a lot, because people are eating lots of meat, like too much protein. So, I don't really believe that that's the case, because if you look at government statistics, we're actually pretty bang on in terms of the reference ranges. But follow up to that question is, do you feel like protein is the marker of satiety? Like, is that the thing that we're looking at, or could we become satiated off carbs? Could we become satiated off fats? Like,
oh yeah, this is all kinds of good stuff here. So yeah, you're right. Our protein is around 12%, I think, which is actually in another rat model is that's the highest point of the most overeating. If you get protein down to 12%, they overeat the most. And if you get it up to like 30, I forget the percent, they eat the least. So yes, and so there's many things going on there. And one of the things is, protein has a higher thermic effect of food, the TEF, right? The thermic effect of food is your body, it's harder for it to use protein. So it takes more of an expenditure to digest it. So you naturally, use it inefficiently in a way so that you can eat more, It's the most, so it's satiating in that way, in the sense that you can eat a lot of it and the calories will matter less. It's hard to exactly say what's going on.
I know what you mean. I mean, also the other side of that is that, carbs turn to fat ultimately, turn to sugar, turn to fat. Fat, especially, if you're eating perhaps too many of the wrong types of fats, will definitely lead to weight gain as well, especially if you're not fat adapted. But proteins sort of like stand on their own, where it's very difficult. It's a
building block. And
it's difficult to become fat from eating too much protein. Like on its own.
It's a very hard conversion to do that for your body. And then also, it's just satiating too, in combination with fat too. It's very satiating where you're just full. But then you're right though, but some people can develop satiating diets with carbohydrate, with whole food carbohydrates and
fiber,
Yeah, if you have a lot of fiber, or if you have potatoes are supposedly very satiating. They did a 1995 Holt study that showed that it was one of the most satiating foods. But I mean, I wouldn't recommend that, especially most people. It's like very starchy. But it's possible.
Yeah.
right? To be
Yeah.
satiated on different foods. But there's also a difference between being full after a meal and having true satiety.
What is that? Like, yeah, explain that to me a little bit.
So it's kind of like, you picture your stomach. There's like, my stomach is full of something and I'm full. And right. And then there's a difference between 6 hours later, am I full or am I starving? So lots of the plant-based community, they're like, oh, they have these graphics. Like, look at, you're eating all these vegetables and starches and look at how full your stomach is. I'm like, yeah. And then you're starving 2 hours later. But if you're eating truly satiating foods, which can include fiber, right? And nothing against vegetables or fiber, but it's based on protein and fat, then you will truly be satiated 6 hours later, or, depending on how much you eat. Like I, am completely, don't think about food for many 16 hours at a time, and then if I eat, then I'm full for 7 hours, and then 7 hours later I'm like, oh, I'm getting a little hungry, and then I work out and eat again. So I mean, I am very satisfied for 7 hours at a time, and I don't know a lot of plant-based eaters that can be full for that amount of time.
Yeah, and I think it's an important distinction to make. Is immediate satiety versus long-term satiety, right? And I've seen, Ted Nyman. I've seen his graphics that he puts up on Twitter, where he's actually done the curves, and you can see that being satisfied from protein definitely sustains your hunger for much longer than either carbs or fats.
Exactly.
Which is interesting. So coming back to the second part of this whole eat less, move more, and of course we're flipping that around and we're saying, eat till you're satisfied and move intensely. So what do you mean by move intensely?
Yeah, I like brief, intense exercise. This is another Ted Naiman type of thing. We're basically the same person. We just we had a long podcast where we basically just agreed with each other for 2 hours. He has a good book. Yeah, but move intensely. I mean, this is what we did. But also, there's a bit of a caveat. It's like you don't always have to move intensely. I also like this kind of low, steady, like low. I forget the term for it, but like, going on walks. Like, I think it's great to go on a long walk. I think it's great, like kind of zone 2 cardio. Some of this stuff is really good for your mitochondria and long-term health and all kinds of good stuff. And, going for short walks after you eat. So that's the one caveat. Like, you don't always have to move intensely. And, ancestrally, our ancestors were walking around. They weren't sitting around like we do.
They weren't doing CrossFit for 16 hours a week either, right?
Exactly. So what they did do was walk around, have a lot of movement, just, moving around, going, taking the like the modern equivalent would be using a stand-up desk, taking the stairs, going on walks, all this kind of stuff. And then, maybe they had some brief, intense exercise. They either sprinted, they were catching an animal, they're running away from an animal, they were climbing a mountain, they were doing these intense activities, picking up, large pieces of wood, building shelter. Like, this is, and I believe that it's not necessary to do these insane CrossFit workouts. Good for you if you want to do them. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with it. I'm just saying, for me and Dr. Ted, we both are in good shape. You can look us both up. We do about 15 minutes of resistance training a day. And like, I do it like 15 minutes a day for 4 times a week. And he does about the same. And then, I play basketball for a couple hours, and he does like ultimate frisbee for a couple hours.
It's like fun stuff,
Fun stuff. So we're running around, we're having fun. We're not grueling, treadmill, grueling, terrible workouts. So, and we're in great shape. So you can do it in a short amount of time if you do intense exercise. And so and compound movements. I believe in doing pull-ups and push-ups and squats and, these basic movements. Like, I'm not sitting there doing curls in the gym or doing all these isolated exercises. I'm also going to failure. I think that's really a good strategy, especially if you want to have a quick workout and not have to spend an hour in the gym or more, right? And I talk to guys like Dr. Keith Barr. He's a great PhD scientist who studies this stuff, and he's talking about, if you go to failure, like, that's all your body needs. You will have this muscle protein synthesis if you go to failure, and you can move on. And he's like, I go into the gym. I think his is about 15 minutes too. He's like, I do these like 6 exercises and then I leave. But it's like, you got to go to failure. And I use drop sets. If people are familiar with drop sets, it's say I'll do 50-pound dumbbells and I'll bench press those until I can't do them anymore, right? You just go as hard as you can. Put them down. Grab the 40-pound dumbbells. Go as hard as you do, as many as you can. Put them down. Grab the 30-pound dumbbells. And I just go out. So I'm using these 30-pound dumbbells, which isn't that much weight, but I am dead. You know what I mean?
Once you've done like 3 or 4 sets and you've gone down, you're done.
So I can do that all. And then I just worked my chest and tries very well. And it was only a few minutes, really. I'm getting a cardiovascular workout too. I'm in there for 15 minutes. I'm breathing hard. So I'm not saying I'm a bodybuilder, and I'm not saying that, this is the way to become a bodybuilder, but this is a way to spend 15 minutes and get really healthy. And I gained muscle.
So what are your thoughts then on I know calisthenics or calisthenics?
Calisthenics, yeah.
Yeah, I know that's like becoming like a thing nowadays. And I know it's actually pretty old school. It's not a new thing by any stretch. But the idea of like combining intermittent fasting with more of, let's just say, a low carb diet, higher proteins, higher fats, lower carbs, and then combining that with calisthenics. Like, what are your thoughts on that? Because I know a lot of people in your space are kind of doing that nowadays.
Yeah, well, you don't have to do it, and it's just more functional movement. I mean, calisthenics are kind of just push-ups, pull-ups, like these functional movements. And Dr. Ted really likes them because he works with all kinds of patients, all kinds of budgets and incomes, and you can do it on your own. And if you can look up a YouTube video and figure out how to do a workout with no equipment, right? You can sit in your hotel room, maybe you're traveling, and you could do like one-legged pistol squats. You can do push-ups. You can do all kinds of stuff with no equipment. But personally, I have a weight vest, and I'm up to 40 pounds now. I maxed it out, so I have 40 pounds waist vest. I do pull-ups, then I take it off, and then I do more pull-ups, and I'll do stuff like that where I'll do dips with it on and then take it off and do more, so I can really go to failure. And but I mean, most people could just probably, do it without the vest and work up to that eventually.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the other thing as well, right? Like, for people just starting out, like failure is going to happen real quick. You're just not going to be able to do it. But the more you do it, the more, I guess, the better you get at it. And
you actually, in the beginning, it should be almost the opposite. Instead of going the weight vest route, you want to do assist type exercises where how can I do a dip with an assist? Like maybe you could, use your foot to like help you a little, or some people have like pull-up machines in a gym where they put the bar down and it helps pull you up a little. Or you even do push-ups against a wall or do push-ups against a couch, right? And instead of doing perfectly flat push-ups, you can just lean against something and do push-ups. So work up to it.
Mm-hmm. No, I think it's all, one of the things I've enjoyed about our conversation today is just being, it's a bit more of a sensible approach to doing things. So much of what we hear about out there in the nutrition space, especially, it's just, there's one way of doing it and it's the only way of doing it. And if you don't do it that way, well, it's just never going to work for you. And I think that, again, maybe something I would get your opinion on, but I've enjoyed our conversation today for that reason. First of all, is because I do see some flexibility. I see that we're not necessarily having to go the full keto route or agonizing over calories or agonizing over exercise. It's just eating a whole foods diet with a lower carb, higher protein to fat intake, fasting, maybe working your way into the fasting, and then some movements, functional movement, whatever that is for you, and working your way up. So I think it's all sensible advice that most people out there can actually tap into and they can do, which is fantastic. But what are your thoughts? I think perhaps finally, and unless there's anything else you want to talk about, but your thoughts on bio-individuality.
Yeah, that's a hard one. Yeah, I'm so conflicted on that because I kind of flip like every hour almost or every day where I think, man, there's no one size fits all diet. Everyone's a individual snowflake. And then the next hour, I'm kind of thinking, I'm like, man, we're all the same. We're all just Homo sapiens. It's like you go to a zoo, we don't treat every single monkey as an individual snowflake and give them, their individual little diet. It's kind of both, and it's kind of both. But there are many people with many very acute problems, right? There's no denying. There's people who eat a peanut and will die. There's people who are very gluten intolerant.
Hmm.
and all kinds of things like that. So 100% there is, but then there's also, again, I think it's a Dr. Ted Naiman thing. He's just like, somewhere out there, there's a planet where they stuck a whole bunch of aliens, took a whole bunch of humans and stuck them in some kind of display case, and they're just feeding them, some meat, eggs, fish, and some vegetables, and they are all thriving.
They're doing good. Yeah.
You know what I mean? So I'm kind of like straddling the fence here, but it's kind of like that.
Hmm. Well, I think also there's a difference between a therapeutic diet and more of a long-term sustainable diet, right? Therapeutic, if someone comes in and they've got whatever X illness, you're going to have to do something therapeutic to intervene to, move the needle forward for them. But perhaps once you've got rid of their psoriasis or their cardiovascular diseases improved or whatever the case, then you can move them onto more of the framework that you've outlined today.
Yeah.
And I've said that for years. The constitutional diet versus therapeutic diets are very different things.
That's big. No, that's good to note. And that a lot of people, the problem is you're just going out on social media and hearing all this like crazy stuff because that's a nuance that people aren't going to get down into when you're just doing a tweet or something. And I did remember one more thing I wanted to say is, tying it all together, and you're talking about how simple it is. My whole thing is about how to make it sustainable for life, right? And I'm sure you are as well. There's a lot of people out there that are like, oh, well, you could just do this and you can lose weight this way. I'm like, yes, you can, but you're not going to do that for life. You're on some crash diet. It's crazy. You're going to maybe lose a lot of weight in an unhealthy way very quickly, and it's not going to ever last. So all the things we mentioned today are simple ways to live. I don't want to call it the sapien diet. And also, I don't even want it to be about my little sapien diet nomenclature. But really, I'm talking about is all good diets have in common is the simple things we're mentioning. And you can call it whatever you want. But it's just that it's something that's sustainable for life. It's a way of life. And it's not restrictive of it. And every day I eat, it's amazing. And and even the workouts, like, yeah, maybe I could be doing 45-minute, powerlifting workouts and be gaining a lot more muscle, but that's not sustainable for me. I'm not going to do that every day. I'm not going to want to do it. Part of why this stuff works is because 15 minutes, I just go in there. I'll go in there in flip-flops. I got this little gym in my apartment complex. I'll just go. I won't even change clothes. I'll go whatever I'm wearing, throw on some flip-flops. I'm in LA, it's warmer.
Yeah.
Go in there and I'll do it. I don't have an excuse not to do it because it's so easy. So these are like these big things that are important that people should realize that are important in their lifestyle for the rest of, what's going to be sustainable.
Yeah. Well, and I think, it's pretty bang on, because if you start looking at the dropout rates for veganism and vegetarianism, upwards of 70% of plant-based eaters will eventually go back to eating meat. And if you look at the keto on the flip side, I think it's about 90% of people who adopt a keto diet will eventually fall off that diet because it's just insane to try and manage that. And to just from like, okay, I can't have a beer, or I can't go out for breakfast, or it's just, I can't go to my friend's house for dinner. It's just like impossible to maintain. So yeah, I love what you're doing. I love the framework that you've painted. I think, especially in speaking with so many people and interviewing so many people. So I'm excited for the documentary to come out whenever that is, and perhaps get you back on the show.
Well, we could finish off with that. It's a long journey. I think it's going to come out by fall.
Oh, cool. Okay, great.
Yeah. We're really trying to get in there. I think fall is a good time to launch a film anyway. And to recap, I mean, the film is more than just about what we talked about. We're giving the entire story of how humans evolved. Even we're going the whole evolutionary path, bringing it up to the present day where we went wrong, and all these kind of bad guidelines. How we should eat, like really talking about all these things, like how can we eat specifically, which a lot of nutrition films don't do. And then even going to the next level of regenerative farming, and be like, okay, now that we know that meat is healthy, how can we do it sustainably and do it correctly? So we're kind of trying to do a lot in this film.
But that's good though. I mean, that's something that I've spoken about a lot as well is regenerative farming. It's not that factory farming is terrible, period. I think everyone agrees with that. But do we have to throw the baby out with the bathwater in terms of saying, well, because factory farming is terrible, we should just do away with it altogether. We shouldn't farm animals at all, and we should all be eating plants. It's like, well, maybe that's not the best solution either. Maybe we need to figure out a better way to farm food. And, that's where Joel Salatin, Polyface Farms and these guys are looking at that. And I think that there is a way to do it properly. Again, small scale farming. I mean, I live out in the countryside here in a small town in Canada, and you go around here, there's only small scale farms. Like, there's big farms, people doing like still the 2,000 acres of corn and whatever, but people that are doing animal farming here, it's all small scale farming. There's no huge giant feedlots and stuff like that. And I think we kind of have to go that way.
That's the solution. That's how we feed the world. We feed the world by feeding your community. And I kind of didn't used to understand that because it didn't make sense to me until I kind of realized what we're talking about is it's exactly right. If every community was fed by these small farms, we wouldn't need these giant factory farms, right? And that it is possible if we focus on each community feeding themselves, then you by default feed the world. Right? We don't need to think of this globalization type of thing. Like, oh my God, we got to ship people in China. We got to ship them grain. Like they're not getting enough food.
Yeah. Well, and the World Health Organization has actually echoed that as well. They've said on numerous occasions that small scale organic farming, regenerative farming is the way that we're going to feed the world. Because I think people like you and I also look at it through the lens of the Western world. We're sitting in first world countries. We've got a lot of luxuries. We have access to all kinds of stuff. But the bulk of the world is not living in this situation. For a lot of them, they're already doing small scale farming. It's already organic because they're,
they have to.
They have to, exactly.
Yeah.
So, so interesting stuff. But I think we'll cut it there. Thanks so much for coming on the show, Brian. And, I had a great conversation. I'm sure we could bang on for another couple of hours.
I'm sure we could. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Where can people find out about what you're doing, catch up with you? And obviously I'll throw those in the show notes as well.
Yeah. If you search Food Lies on any social media platform, I'm there. It's the simplest way. Even YouTube, I have a bunch of content on YouTube on the Food Lies channel, and you can see some of I actually filmed on a small farm near you. Actually, I awesome. Flew into Toronto and we drove out northwest, and I went to Amazing Woman's Farm, and you can find that video. And sapien.org. So my company's called Sapien, and sapien.org, and Food Lies is pretty much the easiest way.
Awesome. Well, thanks for coming on the show again. We'll catch up soon. And for you folks listening out there, as always, if you enjoyed the show today, please consider sharing this with your friends, your family, your community, subscribing, reviewing, and doing whatever you can to get more awesome guests like Brian. So we're going to wrap it up, and you have yourself a beautiful day wherever you are.